In 1962, your own government drafted a plan to kill you and blame it on Cuba. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was an official Pentagon proposal that came terrifyingly close to reality. In 1962, your own government drafted a plan to kill you and blame it on Cuba. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was an official Pentagon proposal that came terrifyingly close to reality. The Cold War context. Picture this. It's 1962, and America is locked in a deadly game of chess with the Soviet Union. Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, has become a communist stronghold under Fidel Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion has failed spectacularly, leaving the Kennedy administration humiliated and the Pentagon hungry for revenge. But there's a problem. The American public has no appetite for another war. Congress won't approve military action without clear justification. So what do you do when you need a war but don't have a reason? You create one. The birth of Northwoods, Lyman Lemnitzer, a hawk who clashed repeatedly with JFK, served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he had a solution. Working with the Joint Chiefs, he developed what would become one of the most shocking documents in American military history. The plan was elegantly simple in its horror. Stage terrorist attacks on American soil, kill American citizens, and blame it all on Cuba. The proposals called for Central Intelligence Agency operatives to both stage and commit acts of terrorism against American military and civilian targets, blame them on the Cuban government, and use them to justify a war against Cuba. The horrifying details. But the devil was in the details, and those details were absolutely chilling. The Pentagon planners weren't thinking small. They were designing a campaign of terror that would make 9/11 look modest by comparison. The plans reportedly included the possible assassination of Cuban émigrés, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, blowing up a U.S. ship, and even orchestrating violent terrorism in U.S. cities. Picture American military personnel murdering Cuban refugees in cold blood, then pinning the blame on Castro. Imagine U.S. agents hijacking commercial aircraft filled with innocent passengers. One particularly grotesque proposal involved sabotaging NASA's space program. The scheme even suggested framing Cuba for sabotaging John Glenn's spaceflight if it failed. They were literally prepared to sacrifice America's space hero to fuel their war machine. Operation Northwoods included a plot to target an empty U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame it on Havana, with Pentagon memos coldly describing plans to sabotage ship in harbor, large fires. But even this pales in comparison to their urban terrorism proposals. The psychology of deception. What makes Northwoods so terrifying isn't just the scale of planned violence. It's the cold frankness of this man. Bureaucratic efficiency with which it was conceived. These weren't rogue agents or fringe elements. These were America's top military leaders, sitting in Pentagon conference rooms, methodically planning the murder of their own citizens. The most common false flag operations consist of a government agency staging a terror attack upon its own people to then falsely blame the uninvolved entity. The goal is always the same: manufacture public outrage to justify predetermined actions. Problem, challenge. But here's where the story takes a crucial turn. The proposal was presented to Secretary of Defense McNamara on March 13, 1962, moving it one step closer to reality. The Pentagon brass was confident, the plans were detailed, and the justification was ironclad from their perspective. The only thing standing between Operation Northwoods and the deaths of countless innocent. The tension in the White House must have been suffocating. Here was Kennedy, a young president already under enormous pressure after the Bay of Pigs disaster, facing his own military leadership, demanding he approve what amounted to state-sponsored terrorism against American citizens. President John F. Kennedy summoned Lyman Lemnitzer to the Oval Office on 16 March 1962, where they discussed Operation Northwoods. Imagine that conversation. The most powerful military officer in America trying to convince the president to authorize the murder of innocent Americans. The military establishment wasn't backing down easily. President Kennedy rejected the idea of such pretext operations at a testy meeting in March 1962, but the JCS continued to push them as the solution to problem of Castro. They genuinely believed that sacrificing American lives was an acceptable price for geopolitical objectives. And then came the moment that changed everything. Operation Northwoods was never officially accepted. It was authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but then rejected by President Kennedy. With that single decision, Kennedy likely saved thousands of American lives. But the consequences for him were swift and severe. 3 months later, he told Lemnitzer that he was being moved from the Pentagon to become commander of U.S. forces in Europe, effectively exiling the man who had proposed killing Americans. The cover-up. For nearly 4 decades, Operation Northwoods remained buried in classified files. They apparently were rejected by the civilian leadership and have gone undisclosed for nearly 40 years. The Pentagon knew exactly how explosive these documents were. The reason these were held secret for so long is the Joint Chiefs never wanted to give these up because they were so embarrassing. According to intelligence expert James Bamford, embarrassing doesn't begin to cover it. These documents revealed a willingness to commit mass murder for political gain. The modern implications. Modern conspiracy theorists use Operation Northwoods as evidence that the American government fakes terror attacks in the 21st century. And while we must be careful not to jump to conclusions, the historical precedent is undeniably disturbing. What Operation Northwoods proves beyond any doubt is that the highest levels of American military leadership were not only capable of conceiving such operations, but were actively pushing for their implementation. If they were willing to do it in 1962, what other operations might have been proposed and approved in the decades since? Operation Northwoods stands as one of the most chilling documents in American history, not because it succeeded, but because it was seriously considered. It reveals a shadow side of government that most Americans never imagined existed. Military leaders so committed to their geopolitical objectives that they were willing to massacre their own citizens to achieve them. The Northwoods Plan was rejected by President Kennedy, but its very existence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, accountability, and the lengths to which institutions will go to achieve their goals. The next time someone tells you that your government would never hurt its own people, remember Operation Northwoods. Remember that in 1962, your military leaders drafted detailed plans to do exactly that. And the only thing that stopped them was one man's conscience. What other classified operations are still hidden in government vaults? The declassified truth about MK Ultra will blow your mind. Watch next to discover how the CIA experimented on unwitting Americans for decades.